It's a very great pleasure to have Valeria Bertacco visiting today. She got her undergraduate degree at the University of Padova in Italy, then moved to Stanford where she got an MS and PhD degree. Spent some time in industry, and since 2003 is at the University of Michigan. And her research area is design correctness. In particular, she's interested in digital systems reliability, post-silicon and runtime validation, and hardware security assurance. She's also won a whole range of very nice awards, starting with the NSF Career, Air Force Young Investigator, IEEE CEDA Early Career, IBM Faculty Award, et cetera, And I think it's just very exciting to have her here today, and please take it away.
Thank you, Georg. So my presentation today is about how to take buggy hardware units and make system that works. So how to take hardware lemons and make system level lemonade. So consider this scenario. I just bought that laptop. And honestly, I have a hate-love relationship with it at this point. But that's not part of the story. So I bought the laptop, and it's sweet, and it's new, and it has all the new features, and there's a lot of computing power. And I'm playing Angry Birds on it and enjoying myself when all of a sudden I get the blue screen of death. So let's run a little survey. What?
Surprise.
Surprise, surprise. Now, let's say that happens to you. Who do you blame? Option number one, the company who designed Angry Bird. Any taker?
No.
2. Option number 2, the graphic driver.
Yes.
Like 10. Option number 3, the camera is not pointing at you. Do whatever you want. Microsoft. OK, another 10. So between Microsoft and the graphic driver, well, there is another option that nobody ever talks about. And I'm sorry that I don't declare a winner. But it's possible that the bug is in the hardware chip. And that bug in the hardware chip messed up the entire software stack and gave you the blue screen of death. So bugs in hardware are actually a reality that is very much an unspoken reality. People don't talk about it very much. Why? And why do they happen? Well, they happen all the time. They tend to have a range of impacts, from a financial impact. Like the most famous hardware bug came out in 1994, and it was called the FT bug. It was in an Intel processor, and Intel had to replace every single chip that included that bug anywhere in the world. So an Intel person would come and change the chip on your desk. That cost them a whole lot of money. If that happened today, it would cost them more than $1.2 billion, just because the ramp up of the Intel chips are much faster today. So financial impact out of that. Security and safety impact. There was an Intel Pentium chip that had an instruction that was supposed to be unencoded. But if you send that instruction to the chip, F00F, the system will hang. So if I'm clever enough that I can get to different chips in a data center, I can perpetrate a denial of service attack. News of bugs come out all the time, and they usually have an impact on the ability of the company to get market share or the stock of the company. AMD had this bug on the latest phenom, on the TLB, in 2007. Another family of phenom was affected by a bug in the L3 cache. And by the way, like these bugs, they could find a workaround by shutting down certain components, but then the performance of the system would go down so much that you're better off buying the previous processor. So what's the point to spend all this money to get the latest and greatest, and then the latest and greatest behave worse than the previous one? Very recently, this is from 2 months ago, an Intel chip for an Ethernet controller that is integrated in the main processor was designed such that if I send a certain shaped packet, the whole system will hang. And for instance, the Intel Haswell chip that is about to come up is being delayed because of problems in fixing some problem with the USB 3.0. So news like this come out all the time. They're not as famous as graphic driver bugs and Microsoft bugs, but they can be just as dangerous. Now, why are there bugs out there? Well, I want to tell you one thing before that. So before 1994, if there was a bug in the chip, everybody would be super quiet about it, and we hope these people don't find out about it. But then Intel became smart. They said, if we don't tell people about it, when they find it, we need to replace the chip, because we basically sold them a product that is not what we tell them it does. So they started this thing that every hardware company does today. of publishing the list of bugs they know about. So I will just tell you, the chip you bought doesn't have the original specification that I published, but it has this modification to that specification. And they don't call them, it has this bug. They say, it's a specification update. And it works in this other way. And this is a sample from the Nehalem processor. Notice how most of them have no fix. Like, they don't know how to fix it. They have no plan to fix it. I mean, the Nehalem is going to live with those bugs for its entire life. So where do bugs come from? Well, we have to look a little bit at how people develop processor. We start from a specification, and then a bunch of engineers have to develop an RTL-level description of that design, usually Verilog VRCDL. And then you can start using tools. So there is a tool that translates that specification into a netlist. And then you have other tools that are place and route and produce masks. And then eventually you send it to a company who give you a chip back. So you have a physical chip in your hand. The problem with the bugs is that every time you do a translation, you may inject bugs in this process. So every single stage can have initial bugs, additional bugs. And by the way, the specification can have bugs too, but I'm just not going to get to that point yet. And then eventually, when you're fairly comfortable that the whole system has been verified, every single level has been compared to the previous one, and all the representation of your idea of the chip is correct, then you can say, I'm going to start selling it to the customer. You integrate it in the system you sell. Now, this process is extremely complex and is extremely prone to bugs. And this little chart is showing you how many times people are getting it wrong. So the yellow line is showing how many respins people have to do for a typical chip. Now, a respin is when I produce my physical silicon, and I find some critical bugs on it, and that I cannot sell to my customer, so I have to fix them and then produce silicon again and test it again. So as you can see, in 2004, it was typical to have 2 or 3 respins. But as years increase, the blue line is 2007, the green line is 2010, the number of respins has been increasing. And now, this is particularly true for companies like IBM and Intel, where they give you a processor that you can program. If you are NVIDIA, you're shielded from all this. Because if your chip has bugs, you work around them through the compiler. Like, people never program the chip. People use the library that you give them, so you have software techniques to hide that. OK, so how do people do this? Even after all these respins, there are always bugs that end up released into the system and can cause all sorts of problems, from nothing to financial problems to crashes when you don't expect them and you think it's somebody else. So why can't they get it right? Well, transistor sizes have been decreasing. Because of that, we can fit much more functionality in a chip. So the complexity of the chips have been increasing tremendously. And the more complex the chips, the harder it is to get it right. And the typical size of a design team, a hardware design team, has been growing over time. So in 2007, we had so many design engineers and so many verification engineers. 3 years later, the number of design engineers have been growing by about 4%. But the number of verification engineers has been growing by 58%. Now, if we keep this trend going, within 50 years, the entire population of India will have to be a verification engineer. Now, Indians like to be engineers, but not all of them, right? Some would like to be doctors or lawyers. So this is not exactly feasible. And this is a study that my students did, where they went online and looked at the specification updates and plotted, for a number of Intel processors, the number of bugs that are known, that are released to customers. So if you look at this, the Pentium M was released with about 15 bugs in 2003. And then, over the lifetime of this product being sold, the number of bugs discovered increased up to 60. But the important thing to notice in this chart is when they switch to multi-core processor, the trend became much steeper. And now in the i7, they get to find out about 6 bugs every month. 6 bugs they cannot fix anymore because they are in the customer product, and they can have any impact that they want. So how do people go about trying to catch these bugs and trying to isolate them and fix them? So let's say that I'm doing a test. I'm running a test on my new system, and I finally managed to boot Linux. And I'm running this boot up for about 10 seconds, which corresponds, if the system is at 2 gigahertz, corresponds at about 20 billion clock cycles. So the company who has to try to nail down this bug and figure out what's the problem, trying to fix it, has to reproduce this, right? So they need to be able to run for 20 billion clock cycles to figure out the problem. Can they do that? Not so much. So they have a few tools for that. They can use software simulation, which It's great. It's a traditional tool that everybody uses, but it runs at about 10 cycles a second. So if I want to run 20 seconds on my real system in this platform, that takes about 60 years. Completely unacceptable. There are accelerators, so basically FPGA platform that you can use to map your hardware and run much faster. And on those platforms, I can reproduce a problem in about 2 days. And by the way, think about this, right? I want to reproduce a problem. I don't do it once. I have to reproduce like 100 times until I narrow down exactly what's going on. So it's not just, 2 days, I'm done. And then there are post-silicon platform and runtime platforms. So post-silicon is when I have my chip, it has been manufactured, and I have it in-house, and I can do all the tests I want until I'm comfortable that I can sell it to my customer. Runtime is after that. I sold the chip to my customer. It's embedded in a full system doing something. So on both those platforms, obviously, I can run full speed. In 10 seconds, I reproduce my problem. So you would say, OK, lady, just use this one and go for it and reproduce your bug. Well, there is a catch. In software simulation, I get to monitor every signal I want. That's helping me a lot to figure out where the problem is. As I move to this faster platform, my ability to observe the internals of my chip becomes smaller and smaller. And when I'm in the system level, I don't even have my hands on the chip, right? I have my hands on the system, so I don't get to see at all what's going on. So root causing the bug becomes harder and harder the faster you are. So you have to trade off performance with ability to debug. Just for your information, in a typical development of a complex processor, about 98% are discovered in this phase before I have silicon. These are the bugs that tend to happen frequently and that to happen, very close, relatively close to the reset state of the system. The post-silicon platform is very good to discover bugs that are really deep in the design, and they are rarely occurring. So these are only 2%, but they're difficult to debug, and they are important bugs. And then there is a little bit of technology in trying to fix bugs at runtime after I release the system. That's mostly kept for the unknown bugs. I'm about to sell my system. I still don't know what else can go wrong, and I try to put some protection there. Typically, that's microcode patching in industry today. So ability to reprogram what a certain instruction does in a processor. So what are my lemons in this whole story? My lemons are the functional bugs that manifest in these always increasing complex hardware. My limited ability to validate and diagnose. In a sense, I have to trade off validation with observability, or re-execution with observability. There are no repeatable bugs. That's a nightmare of people that do post-silicon. By the way, in a typical, so let's say Intel, we got to the first tape out, we got the chips back, and then it's a rush to get comfortable that that chip is working. And actually the engineers are working around the clock in an 8-hour shift to keep running as many tests as possible on those few chips they have. And the nightmare are those no repeatable bugs. Now, I don't have a beautiful Verilog model of my design. I have a physical system that is sensitive to temperature and power, and that's good transistor and weak transistors. And so sometimes I have the same chip and I run the same test, and sometimes the test passes and sometimes the test fails. And I don't even know if I'm hitting a real bug or some strange environmental condition. There are also security vulnerabilities that can perpetrate it for hardware bugs. And we did a project a few years back where we were able to use temporary transistor failure for voltage control to extract the private RSA key from a server, from a 1024 RSA key. And finally, there are temporary and permanent transistor failure that occur in chip. And the expectation is that given the current trends of technology and given the current transistor sizes today and what they're going to be in 10 years, the expectation is that within 10 years, an average chip will experience about 1 transistor failure a day. And obviously, you don't want your system to give you the blue screen once a day. We need to find workaround for that, so it works just fine with broken transistors. Now, these are a lot of lemons. Today, I'm going to just focus on the first 3 problems, so focusing on the functional aspects of these issues. OK, so I'm going to give you a very quick overview of some of the solutions we did in my group, and then I'm going to focus on just a couple of them. For pre-silicon, we did some work in semi-formal techniques where we combine formal simulation to help guide a logic simulation that try to get to a specific set of tests of states and validate that they're correct. We also developed a couple of years ago a logic simulator based on GPUs that actually runs 10 times faster on average than the fastest commercial logic simulator out there. And we're doing a bunch of work in acceleration where the platform is already pretty fast, but the ability to check things is very limited. So we're trying to improve that aspects of this platform. For post-silicon, we developed a solution called BPS, called Bug Positioning System, that can consider an intermittent bug, those bugs that sometimes you see and sometimes you don't see, and tell you where they are and when they occur. And that's going to give you a lot of help from root causing them. And also some solution to do specific tuned post-silicon validation for both processors and their interconnect. And then in runtime, I developed a solution that can fix bugs that you don't know about, that you don't know you have. And we did that for processor core, and we're also investigating that for interconnect. So today I'm also only going to talk about BPS and Semantic Guardian, only these two solutions, to give you a flavor of what can be done to protect against these correctness issues. OK, so post-silicon validation, I was discussing a second ago, is the whole phase of validation that occurs from when you have the first physical chips in your hand, but you're not sure it works correctly, you're not ready to sell to customers. This is a typical post-silicon validation platform. The chip is somewhere up there, and then all around it, there are all these other components to help monitor the activity, to create peripheral, to be a motherboard, to basically have a lot of investigation set up. Very little ability to look inside the chip, but we can do everything we want from the outside. It's beautiful because you can run all your tests really quickly. You can get very high coverage and find bugs that are deep in the system. The downside is that it's a noisy environment because it's sensitive to all the electrical and temperature and environmental effect of the system. And it's subject to these intermittent bugs, bugs that occur occasionally and not all the time. So what are exactly intermittent bugs? I run a same post-silicon test on a chip that is under validation. Sometimes the test passes, sometimes the test fails randomly. Usually, 95% of the time it passes, and 5% of the time it fails. And what I want to do is figure out where is the bug so I can eliminate it. So that's our goal. Specifically, we want to be able to localize a failure in time and space. With space, I mean I want to be able to give the designer a bunch of signals in the chip and say, look at these guys, because these are the ones that are screwing up. And then you can look at those in a beautiful RTL mode and start analyzing the functionality and figure out what's wrong. And in time, I want to be able to identify when during the test execution it occurs, so I only look at a small portion of time. I want to be able to tolerate non-repeatable execution, exactly the intermittent bugs. If I want consistency, this is not the thing to do. And then I want to be able to adapt to many different designs, not be stuck to only processor. I mean, it has to be flexible to everything. So this is the approach we used. On chip, we monitor some node activity. Now, I know I just said you cannot monitor on chip, but we figured out a special thing that can be done, and I'm going to describe it in a second. On chip, I monitor the activity of some signals. Then I want to get that information on the outside. And this channel out of the chip is actually a very low bandwidth channel. So I need to bring out very little data from the chip. And then I'm going to use, in software, some techniques to figure out what the problem is, basically a statistical model of the problem. OK, so how hardware logging works. Instead of saying, please pipe out from the chip every single activity of this signal, I say, create a signature of it. A signature is basically a compressed form of the behavior of the signal over time. So we take a signal like this that goes up and down over time, and we divide the execution in windows. And then for every windows, we can compute different metrics. What we like to do is compute how many clock cycles the signal was at 1. It's a very simple signature that has a characteristic that I want, and I'm going to show you why. The one thing to notice here is when I'm in pre-silicon, the world is very deterministic. If a test has to give me a certain correct behavior, and to have that correct behavior, I want to see a certain waveform, I should see those waveforms all the time, and when I don't, that's a bug. But in post-silicon, with these intermittent bugs, I cannot expect that. I mean, it can be that there is a little bit more delay from memory, and so my response is going to come out later, and my pattern of ones and zeros is going to be all shifted or just different. So what I'm trying to find out is a way of creating this signature so that The tests that pass give me a certain type of patterns, and the tests that fail give me another. I want to differentiate them, and that differentiation is critical here. So how do I do that? We studied, with some undergraduate students, we studied maybe 20 different types of signatures. The type of signatures I want are those filters that can absorb very easily small differences and represent big differences as different. So this type of signatures, like Hamming distances and CRC checking, where minimal difference can spread the signature somewhere else, are not good for me, because I can have minimal difference due to very little variation that had nothing to do with the bug. I want things like this, where my passing test case have a completely different distribution than my failing test cases. And time at 0 and time at 1 and toggling are simple to compute, because it's very simple to compute how many times you're at 1. And they have this characteristic, right? If I am 1 for extra clock cycle, I'm just one little value away from my original signature. The hardware implementation is very simple. And this is actually, there are some companies that have this in place already for performance purposes, so it may cost you just nothing to put this on the chip. You have a number of registers, and what these registers do, they just increment every time one of the signals you care becomes switch to value 1, and then you store this in memory, so you collect many, many signatures before you have to bring them off chip. And the trick of this business is these multiplexers here. The multiplexer help us select which signals we are monitoring during different execution. Because you don't have, a typical system in post-silicon can access 16 signals per execution. I can change with 16, but only 16. And 16 is teeny compared to what I need. So, you have this multiplexer to basically be able to choose what signals you want to monitor. And we figured out that this hardware would take less than 1% of area on a pretty complex chip like the OpenSpark design. So now I took all these signals on chip. I gather signatures over time for each of the ones you care I monitor, and I pipe them out of the chip. Now I have all this data. I need to figure out where is my bug. How do I do that? We built this bug band model. And the way it works like this. First of all, I only look at the tests that passed. I know which test passed. I know which test failed. I just don't know where the bug is. I take the test that passed, and I build, for each window, I build a distribution of the signatures values I got for that test. So for instance, in this section, I have my passing band is average plus and minus 2 standard deviation of all the signature I got for that window. And I build this for all the windows of that signal. This is only one signal I'm looking at. Then on top of that, I plot the failing runs, the signatures I got during the failing execution of my test. And for safety, I only put 1 standard deviation, so it's a little bit tighter, and it's probably going to sit, it allows for a little bit of slack, and it sits within the passing band. If at any point in time my passing band diverges from my failing band, that's telling me that the chip is starting to behave in a completely different way than it's supposed to. That's revealing to me that something is going very wrong in there, because I'm getting completely different signatures for that signal. So that's where I say, now I detect the bug. The two have diverged too much. The bug has occurred sometime before that time, right? So the way bugs behave is a little bit of an avalanche problem, where something is wrong in one point on the chip, and that triggers wrong behavior in the signals around it, and that triggers more wrong behavior. And if a bug is really drastic, it's going to make everything go wrong. Those are the easy bugs, the one that makes everything go wrong really fast. The difficult bugs are the ones that start impacting the system really slowly, and maybe not all of it. So my job is to plot every signal one by one over its entire execution and figure out if it diverges. Some signal will never diverge. Those are the signals that are not affected by the bug. Some signal will diverge later, and some will diverge earlier. The first one that diverge are the one closer to the root cause of my problem. So those are the one I want. OK, so I have to do this for every signal. So I start preparing my table with all the windows of execution, all the signals that I want to monitor. And I take the first signal, I build my bug band. Then I consider the second signal, I do the same work until I figure out which are the guys that diverge first. That's the time of the bug. And now I have to tell people which are the signals of the bug. Well, they are the signals that manifest this first deviation. So We evaluated this on an open Spark design. We took 10 different test cases that are distributed with the design. So we didn't design the test cases. We injected bugs, a wide range of bugs I'm going to show you in a second, but from functional to transistor failures to electrical bugs. And we also tried to create an environment that simulated the physical environment. So we tried to create different time in responses from memory to see variation in the behavior. And we were monitoring the top 40,000 signals of the chip. Now, I don't know if you were wondering about this, but before I told you I can look at most 16 signals, and now I'm monitoring 40,000. How does that go together? Well, I'm in a statistical environment. I don't have to look at 40,000 signals all at the same time. I look at 8 now, and 8 later, and 8 after the next run. And at the end, I can just pile all my data together, and it still works. OK, so these are the results we got. So on the horizontal lines, you have all the test cases we were running. On the vertical lines, you have the bugs. So like the first bug, PCX grant SA, it means a stacked fault in the PCI grant signal. The second is an electrical bug on the crossbar. The third is a branch bug, is a functional bug in the branch predictor, and so on and so forth. What you can see is, let me tell you what each type of slot in the table means. So check means I gave you a bunch of signals in response to your desire to root cause a problem that was very closely related to the place of the occurrence of the bug. Check plus means I give you a bunch of signals, including the one of the bug. And then there is NB means no bug, meaning the bug was injected, but the test case, it didn't activate it. So the test completed correctly. There was nothing to be noticed. False positive and false negative. So false positive is when I think I found the bug, but I really just grabbed some noise and called it a bug. And false negative is when I actually don't respond when the bug was actually producing an incorrect result. So these two bugs were actually don't have any check plus, they only get check. And then so we went to look at why that's such a weak response. And what we found out is that we were not monitoring the signal on which a bug was activated. So there was no way we reply with that signal there. We were only looking at the surrounding. Also, notice how these two tests, the floating point test, created a lot of false positives. What we found out is that when we were running those tests, there were a lot of signals that were very noisy. So they were very different pattern of behavior for no reason related to the bug. And so our system would be catching those as root cause of the bug when that was not really the problem. And then in most cases, actually, we were able to detect the bug for most test cases. Those tend to be the easy bugs. The difficult bugs are the ones where it's very few test cases can actually catch it. We went on that front, and we thought, instead of coming up with our ad hoc statistical model, why don't we use something that is more standardized? And that's being investigated for many years, so there are probably better ideas, like machine learning. And so machine learning, for the people on it in the field, is, I'm going to give you the 30-second overview. So you have a machine learning algorithm that is supposed to be trained. So you give him, in my case, test cases, some passes and some fail, and he eats them up, and he learns what is passing and what is failing. And then once he learns enough, he can basically label things for you. You just give him test case, and they will tell you this is a pass one, this is a fail one, and so on and so forth. Yeah. So for our situation, we actually looked at supervised learning, which is exactly what I described. And that wasn't working very well. It was just giving us garbage back. And so we went to look at that and why is that happening? And we realized that, a passing test case is a beautiful passing test case from beginning to end. But a failing test case is not just a failure, right? It's passing until when the bug happens, and then it's failing. So it's very hard for the machine learning algorithm to figure out if that's good or bad, because it's both bad and good. So then we decided to move into one-class learning, where so one-class learning is a type of machine learning that they use, for instance, in credit card fraud, where you learn only from the goods. Like they learn what type of expenditure I do. And I always go to drink my coffee at Starbucks, and then the day I go to Pete's, that's flagged as a fraud. And so we basically only train the system with passing test cases, and when something doesn't look like a passing test case, that's where the problem is. That's where the bug is. So this work is actually ongoing. We found some good results on this, but I think there are aspects of machine learning that can help us with our bug band model, which is much more tuned for exactly the problem we have. So let's summarize this thing about BPS. Example 1 on how to make lemonade. The lemons in my case are the intermittent bugs, which are very hard to root cause and isolate. And instead of saying that's a problem, I'm looking at them as a solution. I'm using exactly the fact that they're intermittent to make them stand out and then isolate where the problem is. So I'm leveraging a problem to develop my solution.
You had some automatic way of selecting all the signals that you monitored, I'm assuming?
Yes, we didn't, I mean, it might not be the brightest, but we basically only consider the top level signals of the chip. And you can envision, you say, well, what if the bug is not in a top level signal, right? But you can envision an iterative process where that is going to tell me, look at this module, and then I'm going to take the top level signals only of that module, and, and then you narrow it down until you get something good. But one thing I want to clarify is I have this beautiful check and check plus here. A real person would never know if they got a check or a check plus. I mean, I know because I'm evaluating the system, so I know if I hit the signal or the bug. As this hardware designer, I give you a bunch of signal, and you have to look at them all, and you don't know if in there is the one. So it's more my way of qualitatively saying how good is this solution more than something you can use as a piece of information. You don't know that until you find the bug. Anything else? Yes?
Are you training on all signals together for one model or separately?
So the machine learning algorithm, sorry, let me repeat the question. You want to know if I'm training on all signals all together to learn for machine learning, right? And that doesn't work. Like, I cannot run the machine learning algorithm on 40,000 dimensions. So we actually cluster the signals in group of 500 and try to do it in a sensical way, meaning group signals in the same unit, so they're related to each other, so the analysis makes more sense, and then do multiple analyses concurrently, meaning everybody for this time window, and then everybody for the next time window, until somebody say, I found a bug, and then you can move on. And by the way, just, I guess, to give you a hint here, I think the solution, I don't have the results on this is just my thought, but I think the solution what I work the most is to have a bug band model with multiple prongs, which in a sense representing what the cluster is doing for me, allowing things to be clustered in different sections. But this is something still very, very early on. Any other question? Okay. And now we're going to talk about the next solution, which is called Semantic Guardians. So in Semantic Guardian, you're going to say, I'm going to do another lemon with some other lemons. People design chip. And when they design chips, they try to do verification on them. And they run many, many, many tests to try to verify as many situations as they can. The truth of the matter is, no matter how many years they spend in this exercise, they verify a very small portion of the possible configuration and states of the system. And that's my blue area. And there is a huge portion that never gets checked and that may or may not include bugs. And that make you think, of course I get blue screen. I should get a blue screen every other second, right? I mean, almost nothing has been verified. But that's a static view of the world. In a dynamic world, the blue area is much bigger. Why? Because a chip spends most of its time doing always the same thing over and over and over. And then every now and then there's something original. So even if I verify a very small portion, from a dynamic standpoint, I'm verifying the stuff that happens all the time. Indeed, it's so easy to verify that. It naturally happens when I run in my test. So that's why you get blue screen once a week. About right? Yeah. And that makes this whole business much more viable. So what did we think about doing? We said, OK, so let's verify at design time the most common solutions so that we are confident that the chip is going to spend 90% of the time in things and configuration and states I verified and I checked that they work correctly. And then we have to have some sort of mechanism on the chip that at runtime detects when I'm crossing this boundary, when I'm getting out of what I verified. And if I do, I need to bring it back right away. So I never go in this uncharted territory, which could have bugs. And how do I do that? I use the inner core. So the inner core is I'm going to explain it in a second, but it's a way so that when the behavior of the system is about to cross a verified boundary, I immediately bring it back. I never use this portion of my system. So what is the inner core? The inner core is a subset of the components of your processor, of your system. We actually did it for processor specifically. It's a subset of the component of your system that can execute the entire instruction set architecture. No performance, nothing fancy. It can just do all the basic ISA. Indeed, all we ask him to be able to do is to execute one instruction at a time, and he can take as many clock cycles as he wants. So you need the basic data path, you need the memory interface, but you don't need any data forwarding. You don't need any branch prediction. You don't need any prefetch. You don't need nothing fancy. In normal mode, my entire processor is working. My entire processor, I mean, 90% of an area on a processor chip is there to boost the performance of that thing. And there is very little component that are critical to just make the thing happen. Like if I have multiple pipelines, I really only need one. And I'm not even using it in a pipeline mode. So the goal of having this subset at hand is that I can formally verify that subset. Indeed, we did formally verify for a couple of processors that there was an inner core that was completely correct. You don't have to touch the RTL of your design. You don't have to like prune out the components. It's very simple. You just control the fetch unit, and the fetch unit let one new instruction come in only after the last instruction is gone. So you guarantee there is only one instruction in flight. The control flow is very simple. And automatically, all the components that are performance-oriented, even if they compute incorrect results, their results are not used. So you don't have to worry about anything. So the way it works is, for those few situations, the blue area, those few states of the system that are very few but also very common, we use our full bus system because we verify that at design time. And then for those huge number of configuration of the system that occur very rarely, very long tail, then we use the inner core so that it's never allowed to go into the yellow area that could contain bugs. So how do I do that? I have to design a component and embed it in my processor that can detect when I'm crossing that line so that it can shut down the main part of the system and just use the inner core. And so during the design time, while I'm doing all my verification effort, I need to partition my system into what I trust and what I don't trust. I trust what I verified. I don't trust anything else. If it's not verified, it could be a bug, so I don't want to trust it. And so this idea of the Semantic Guardian is to basically take verification, which is a task where if you do a mistake, the whole chip is broken. I want to convert that in, if I do a mistake, I lose performance, but I don't break the chip. So instead of having this high price to pay for every bug that escapes, the price I pay is a performance price. It's going to go into inner core more often, so it's going to be slow more often. No big deal. So in a sense, I'm trading off validation effort with performance and area. Why area? Well, because I have to put the little component there that check the boundary, right? The better I design that boundary, the smaller the area of that little component, the less area it costs me. So let's look at the little animation, how things execute on a processor that has a Semantic Guardian in it. That's my Semantic Guardian. So first of all, the Semantic Guardian is taking some inputs, and those are the critical control state bits that I decided to monitor. I cannot monitor every signal in the system because it would be impossible to do that in combinational time. So in normal mode, the instructions come in, and they start populating the pipeline, and they just walk down the pipeline one at a time. And then let's say that something about who is in what stage in this pipeline detects a bug. So that's something that I haven't verified. It's not necessarily a bug. It's just an unverified status. So my Semantic Guardian here is detecting a certain state combination that is leading to an unverified region. So then it would just flag the recovery controller and say, I got a match. The recovery controller controls the program's counter to tell him, stop fetching new instructions. It flushes the pipeline, and then it starts fetching one instruction at a time. As I said, only one instruction can be in flight in the processor at any point in time. That instruction will go down the pipeline on its own. Obviously, it will not have any dependency with anybody else because there is nobody else. And then when that instruction is done, Then I go back to normal mode, and I refill my pipelines, and I go down the system. I run the system as before. So as you can see, if I use something like this, the system will work correctly, no matter whether it has bugs or not. The issue is, if I go to inner core mode too often, I pay a big performance price, because in inner core mode, I'm very, very slow. So it's very important that what you verify is the most common scenario, so you know you're not going to go to inner core very often. How do I design my semantic guardian, which is, in this case, the yellow box there, like the little combinational block that has to tell me, about to go into a possible unknown space, you need to go into inner core mode. So over the verification of the system, before is produced, I need to track down which configuration I checked and which has been verified. And then those, at tape out time, are going to be synthesized in my semantic guardian and then included in the chip. And actually, there are a bunch of optimization you can do into this space. For instance, it's very important that the semantic guardian is small. So sometimes I may take configuration I verified and not include them just to get a better, a more optimal synthesized component, so it's easier to, it's easier to contain the area. Okay, so control signals. How do I know which are the relevant control signals to monitor for my semantic guardian? We took a two-way superscalar processor, and we look at all the flip-flops in that design. It has 14,000 flip-flops. 10,000 of them were for the data path, and 3,000 of them were for debug purposes. 400 were control bits. Now, I cannot design a combinational logic block with 400 inputs. It's just too complex. So what we did is we figured out that there are a lot of optimization that can be done. This is a pipeline processor. So a lot of bits are just copied over from pipeline state to pipeline state. I only need one copy. A lot of things are encoded in one hot form, and I can use a much more complex encoding. So by doing all this, for instance, only considering the head of the ROB, not all the entire ROB, because only the head of the ROB is actually going to matter, I could cut down the number of inputs to my semantic guardian to a very small number, and now I can actually synthesize a circuit with it. Now, we took this alpha processor. We actually took also another simpler processor that was an in-order pipeline, and we created many different versions of the processor with different bugs in it. So the first bug is a bug that manifests when there are two branches back to back. The second is a conditional branch after an unconditional branch, and so on and so forth. And we wanted to see if the system could execute correctly, and all the tests could run correctly if I have my semantic guardian in place. Because when we are going into the yellow uncharted territory where the bug is possible to occur, we just go immediately back to inner core. But the thing you should notice here is, what's the performance cost of this? Depends. Some bugs were detected at design time when I was still doing the verification. So those got fixed. They never made it to silicon. They were not a problem. Other bugs occurred very frequently, like one time in 25, one time in 20,000 cycles. Obviously, the more often the bug happens, the more is the performance price you have to pay to fix the problem, to work around the problem. But in general, so one thing I guess you have to keep in mind in looking at this chart is Intel told me that nothing that happens more often than once in 300,000 cycles gets out of the company. Like bugs that are more frequent than one every 300,000 cycles, they can catch. The thing that escaped the company is more rare than that. Obviously, once they release the product, there is such a huge population of users that stuff starts happening for real too. So as you can see, for those scenarios, the impact in performance will be very, very minimal for this solution. OK, so our second example, the lemons are the bugs nobody still knows about. Nobody yet knows about it, right? They are just the unverified portion of my chip, which may or may not contain bugs. And what I do is I use a verified inner core. I use what I could verify to work around them and never let them occur. So just to conclude, I guess especially for the students, when you look from the right angle, you can actually use your own research problem as part of the solution instead of trying to kill the problem with a completely out there solution. And I welcome any other question you may have. I did all this work with all my students, by the way, which are listed there.
This verified core also being released to, say, compiler makers, so they can, at compile time say, okay, we might go into this path and we don't want to slow down anyway, so can we somehow reorder the execution to even avoid it on a single core? Or is it just too much?
So you're asking if I can envision the inner core to be released to the compilers maker so they can make a choice to create instruction and sequence of instruction that never trigger the inner core mode. So in that case, so all I need to release is what fraction of the system has been verified, right? Because I can trust those, I can trust that to work in normal mode. And I mean, personally, yes, I envision that happening. When you're a semiconductor company, how much they release is as little as possible, I think. So I don't know. I mean, the technology would definitely allow it.
I think I have a similar question, but from a different angle, trying to understand the inputs into the inner core, your 79 signals or whatever. Are those at a level that are sort of understandable at the ISA level? Can you look at one of the combinations that leads to a hit, if you will, and go into inner core safe mode and say what that corresponds to? Like, oh, you just did a privilege mode instruction 2 cycles after something else? Or are they too low level to really comprehend?
So, okay, let me repeat the question. So the question is if the signals that I monitor for the inner core, so the inputs to my inner core, are such a low level that from an ISA or architectural standpoint, I cannot say anything about them, or if actually they could be translated into specific situations in English. And the answer is, yeah, exactly specific situation in English. Indeed, we looked at specification update documents to be inspired of what bugs to put there and what signals to look at. And if you were to do this in a real scenario, you would actually look at where were the bugs in the past. So I monitored the right bits, the one that seems to be revealing of difficult problems that people are challenged to catch before product release. And I would like to add something to your question too. If you think about it, like most embedded system companies are doing exactly what you suggested, right? They have the compiler team and they have the hardware team. And the compiler team job is to never hit what the hardware team didn't verify, right? And whenever that doesn't work because their compiler generates sequence of instruction that hit the bug, they send you a patch of the compiler so that we work around the bug. Indeed, that's a big difference, right? Intel spends 1.5 years at least from first silicon to product of the release. NVIDIA spends 100 days, and they do no respins. Right? It's not that like their hardware is perfect, but they can work around problem much faster because they give you a software layer on top. Yes?
I've thought about ways to extend the inner core concept to interactions between multiple cores, like in cache coherence and stuff, where a single instruction at a time might not be sufficient to explore the state space of how multi-cores interact. Does that make sense?
So you would like to know if I explore how the solution could be ported to a multi-core environment where there are different instructions going on in different cores and how they can possibly interact with each other. And I definitely did not bite at the problem in a single big bite like you're describing it. What we've been doing is looking at a solution of this type for interconnect. And so then I would have inner cores for the individual processors and an inner core, ideally, for the interconnect, which is the one responsible to get the memory communication between the cores. And hopefully that is enough to get the whole system to be protected. But I'm waving my hands a little bit on that space.
So any more questions? If not, let's thank Valeria again for an awesome talk.